Hello. So, today is the 1st of January. Oh my gosh, 2022. What? And I wanted to talk about reading and how I got back into reading last year in 2021, and also how I'm planning to keep that going this year, 2022. So, the other day, I was thinking real hard, and I thought, oh my goodness, I think I only read one book in 2020, like start to finish. Like I read a few books in 2019 for school things, but I think in 2020, I might have only read one book. I don't have any record of my reading in 2020 though, so it's hard to say. But last year, 2021, last year, I started keeping track of things. I started out on Goodreads and I switched to Storygraph in the midst of the year because we don't like to support Bezos. I think everyone's on board with that. Storygraph's actually pretty cool because they also have pretty good like trigger warning sections, which I appreciate. And I'm trying to load the app, and this is the first time the app has given me this much trouble, so I think it just knows that I'm talking about it. Oh my goodness. Maybe I'll have to use my laptop. But so, I intend to DNF everything that I had on my currently reading because there's about 6-7 books that I had like been meandering through for several months and did not manage to finish by the end of December. And I think it's time to just say goodbye to them, like respectfully, but goodbye. And I can always pick them back up, but I'm going to take them off of my currently reading in Storygraph because I think it gives a nice clean slate for the new year. Now there is one book I just started last week, not even just like a few days ago. That one's gonna stay on my currently reading because I am currently reading it, but everything else is getting reset. Now, here's the truly impressive thing. I told you I might have only read one book in 2020. In 2021, I read 37 books. A couple of them are shorter novellas, maybe. One's kind of pushing it, so we can maybe say 36, because it was like an ebook I bought, but it was only like 50 pages, so I don't know. It sort of counts. But I want to talk about how I managed to do that, how I managed to read 37 books in 2021, and how I think others could maybe use similar things, and how I'm hoping to keep that going this year, 2022. So, why had I not been reading so much? I think this is sort of a classic thing that happened to a lot of like gifted kids, reading obsessed kids. I was unstoppable as a reader in elementary school, like always reading. Even through middle school, like my friend group mostly hung out in the library. So like I was a reader always. Can you hear the siren? But then college happened. And mandatory readings for classes constantly, always, just draining all of my brain power happened. And because I was being forced to read so much stuff that I wasn't really enjoying in college, at least the first couple years, a lot of it not so enjoyable, I just never wanted to spend my little amounts of downtime also reading. My eyeballs were tired. My brain was done with words. So basically all of college, like 2016 to 2020, I barely read. Even though I was a humanities major, I only read like what was required. I didn't even finish like most of the novels that we were supposed to read. I read like half to 2/3 of most of the novels we were supposed to read, me being a humanities student, but I sort of just lost all interest until junior year, actually, when I had to get ready for my senior like thesis capstone project, and I ended up reading a few books related to that, which was really cool because it showed me that I could actually enjoy reading a whole nonfiction book, because as a kid I always read fiction. I just destroyed fiction, YA, all of the stereotypical things that we read as kids, you know? But that second to last year of college, I read like 3 or 4 books related to screenwriting and film, and I really enjoyed it, and it was cool because it was one of the first times I had like chosen to read an entire nonfiction book of my own volition, which leads into how I got into reading more thoroughly this last year. So in January, where I actually started, where I plugged in trying to start reading, was I'd been done with college for half of a year, and I was starting to want to learn things again because I had kind of gotten through the burnout around learning, and I decided to pick up nonfiction related to topics I wanted to learn about. Just learning things, and because I chose books that I was really personally interested in and didn't judge myself based on like what that interest was, I was able to read a couple of books that I finished in January. I might have started at least one of them in December, but I finished a couple books in January, nonfiction. And then I decided to take that sort of same non-judgment about the actual book that I was picking and use that to help me get some momentum going in fiction as well. So I actually started reading like a kid's chapter book, like easily like a 5th grade book, maybe even like 3rd grade book for me at least. That was actually a retelling of Rapunzel, which was easy for multiple reasons. I already kind of knew the characters and the story, so it was easier to get invested. I didn't have to sort of figure out what was going on before I could get really invested, which helped. And also, because it was written to that like lower level, it was like super easy to read through once I sat down and actually started reading. So I read that in March, might have finished it in April, I think. And from there, I picked out a couple other just like total no judgment, easy fiction reads. I read more of an adult book that just had a super cheesy premise and had like a pretty simple plot, but it had some entertaining things in it, and it was related to the nonfiction like special interest stuff that I'd been reading. So that tied in and gave me a little bit of a momentum. And then into May is where I really got going with reading several books a month, and that was also helped by trying out different forms of books. This year I read audiobooks, I read on my computer/phone, ebooks, and I also read paper books. And I found that different types of books and different subjects worked better in a certain media than others. So like in May, I discovered that I really like listening to more intense nonfiction as an audiobook because it's easier to make myself like listen to something for 10 minutes that's a little dense, that takes a bit of thought like while I'm taking a walk, as opposed to like sitting down and reading something that feels like a textbook. So I enjoyed audiobooks for like getting into psychology stuff that was a little more like number theory heavy at times. And then I liked having ebooks for things that I wanted to feel sort of like I was just reading like online, you know? So I got like an astrology book that I very much enjoyed that had like a whole workbook component to it as an ebook, and it was kind of cool because it felt like I was just sort of like reading a web page about astrology, which is something I'd already been doing, but after a while I had finished an entire book. And then in June I moved and one of the first things I did was get multiple library cards, so I could also take advantage of checking books out of libraries, which is nice because it gave me access to a lot of books without spending much money, which is really cool. Love libraries, support libraries, and I was able to read some more fiction, and I was also able to like check out a handful of books and then maybe like try to start a few, but then only really get into 1 or 2 of them, which is really cool when there's less pressure. I gotta say, library books and then like just non-judgment with yourself in terms of like what books you're picking out really helped me get going. Like trying to let go of like, if you're on Book Talk or anything like that, of these ideas about what you're supposed to be reading was very helpful for me. So then I did have a little bit of a slump in the fall because I had started putting pressure on myself. So going into September, I had this idea that I really wanted to try and read a bunch of like witchy fiction books before Halloween, and just that like in my head idea of pressure to like read certain things made me lose like all interest in reading, and I finished no books in October or November. Actually, I might have finished like 1 book, but it might have been nonfiction. I sort of lost all of my fiction momentum as soon as I put on myself an idea of what I should be reading, as opposed to just like enjoying what I picked up. But interestingly, in December, I got back into a bit of a swing by switching over to reading plays, theater, and that was cool because the different medium there made it a little bit easier to get back into because it is all dialogue, very much a lot happening really quickly. So giving that different more fast-moving format a try helped me get back into reading and also finish a fiction book in December. So I hope that was somewhat helpful, interesting for you to see like how certain things helped me keep going, whereas others acted more as blocks. I've got to say, once you just say, I'm just going to read one book, and then after that, I'm going to read one book, like, eventually you are going to have the interest, the spark to read more and more, to maybe have a couple books that you're reading at a time. And also having the will to DNF, very helpful. Like, if I had started something but I was not excited to keep reading it, it was okay to stop reading it. So trying to learn non-judgment and take it one step at a time is really how I got back into reading. And now I want to share briefly all 37 books that I read and my thoughts on each. I'm not a very consistent rater, so I'm really bad at giving like number of stars out of 5 just because I don't trust myself to be at all consistent. So I'm gonna try to just spend like one sentence on my takeaway thoughts on each of the books that I read. Now I'm going to do them ranking. I'm gonna go from the bottom to the top for nonfiction and then from the bottom to the top for fiction. I will say my ranking is a lot closer and harder to differentiate for fiction, whereas nonfiction, there were some things that I like listened to as audiobooks in my car or that were just shorter that I didn't get as much out of, but that I did still manage to finish. So nonfiction, the rankings mean more. And we're gonna start with nonfiction because that's also what I read more heavily at the beginning of the year, whereas at the end of the year, I read more heavily fiction. Okay, so nonfiction. At the bottom, 18th, we have Crystals for Beginners, which I listened to as an audiobook, which I might have gotten more out of or feel more useful if I had it as a physical reference book. I kind of enjoyed listening to it just to get like an impression, see if anything stood out to me, hear how she talked about things, because I've been getting into a lot of witchy, Wicca, occult things and all, but this as an audiobook was just like not great. 17 is a cognitive behavioral therapy book. This was a really short, like 50-page one that I read because it was short, but it wasn't a lot of new information, and I actually kind of hate cognitive behavioral therapy, so didn't really enjoy it. There was a couple of concepts though that I hadn't had explicitly explained, so still some value. Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling. This is another one I listened to as an audiobook. I thought this one was a little more interesting. There were like some fun little stories, but because I listened to it while driving, like I couldn't tell you much that I really learned from it, which is why it's so low ranked. 15, Medieval Myths and Mysteries. This one's another audiobook, but it's more like a lecture series. This one was a little more interesting because I found out some things that are like myths that I had maybe previously thought were true but hadn't really thought about very much. But again, with it being an audiobook that I listened to while driving, I did not retain very much of it. The last audiobook I listened to while driving, The 5 Levels of Attachment. This is sort of a follow-up or related to The 4 Agreements. The 4 Agreements is a book I still feel like I should read, but I haven't had like the excitement to read it, so I haven't read it yet. But it was interesting to listen to this book for like a different spiritual, ethical perspective, but because I don't feel like I have the full context, like none of it really stuck too much. And again, I can't listen to audiobooks while driving that I really want to fully process. Next we have the Amenti Oracle Guidebook. Technically, this is just a booklet that came with a oracle deck that I got, but I counted a couple of these because they were such hefty guidebooks, and I feel like they give a really thorough idea on the sort of inspiration or source mythology of the cards that I felt like I learned a lot, and I felt like it should count as a book. And they do have ISBNs. But so this one really got into like Egyptian mythology and sort of their perspective on, I guess, the purpose of human life. And so it was a very interesting read, but not one I felt so strongly about. Next we have Wicca, the guide for a solo practitioner. This is a like classic beginner read within Wicca. By the time I was fully reading it, I had kind of already decided that I didn't fully identify with Wicca, even though I am obviously exploring like paganism and alternative neo-spiritual movements, you know? But this was very good to just get like a lot of information about Wicca and what makes Wicca Wicca, especially without it being attached to like a particular coven's practice. Next we have the Divination Handbook. This one is one of the ones I read in January that got me really going again, and I thought it was really interesting because it spent like just one chapter on a whole bunch of different types of divination tools, and I thought it was really cool to just get like that quick introduction to a lot of different things, even though it's like obviously not going to give you a full guide to any of them because it's so short with each. Next, number 10, Helping Teens Who Cut. This was a really valuable read because of how it relates to my job and also the sort of field I'm planning to work in and maybe go to grad school in, being mental health. I thought this was a really great introduction to DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, as well as going into like the different psychological underpinnings of cutting or any sort of self-harm behavior. Number 9, we have this book called Camouflage. It's another short one and it's graphic, but it's about autism in women, which I thought was very interesting and I appreciated having represented like that. Number 8, we have Burned as a Witch. I heard this topic and this book mentioned on a podcast because January through April I also listened to a ton of podcasts because of the work I was doing at that time. I was able to listen to stuff. Music gets old, you listen to podcasts. And this book did not disappoint. It was very interesting to hear such like a thorough covering of like the life of a person who is thought to like be a ghost, and then after the life, like stories of the sort of haunting and all of that. And it was so thorough on the topic and so deep on just this like one girl, even though it's only like 130 pages. It was super cool. I liked how in depth it was. Next we have the other guidebook I included on the Wild Unknown Archetypes. This one was super interesting because it is like a 200-page book on different archetypes, which applies to like all aspects of life, like different archetypical like figures, items, scenarios, and it's super interesting to think about how universal some of those ideas are within like not only storytelling but within our lives. So it was a very interesting read. Number 6, we have Parts Work. This is one I read as an ebook that made it easier for it to be sort of like a studying type of situation. So this one was sort of an introduction to the idea of like inner family systems. I also started listening to an audiobook on inner family systems, which I did not finish. But this book was cool because it had some pictures and it was pretty straightforward to the point, and I thought it was a great introduction to this sort of theory within psychology. 5, we have the Wicca Wheel of the Year. This book is like super basic, but I thought it was so useful because every like Sabbath holiday it had like a whole bunch of ideas for like stuff you could incorporate to celebrate, and I liked that it had sort of a background and then sort of like recommendations for things to do. It was very straightforward. I like things that are straight to the point, in case you didn't notice. Number 4, the first book I finished this year, is the Modern Witchcraft Book of Tarot. I think this was a great first book for tarot. I got it for Christmas along with my first tarot deck, and it was super useful to reference. I basically read it by using it as a reference for a really long time, and then once I felt like I had a good grasp on most of the cards, I actually went through and read it front to back, and it was great for learning tarot from. Number 3, The Body Keeps the Score. This one I listened to on audiobook, mostly while going for walks, and it was great. I felt like I was able to sort of think about and process it and actually get through the dense content by listening to it, and it opened up a whole new world of interest for me, as within psychology, I'm particularly interested in trauma and how we treat trauma. Number 2, Astrology for Yourself. This is the astrology workbook that I did as an ebook, and it was super useful. I loved how it had all of the applied stuff and it walked you through like how to go through your own birth chart. Great way to learn more about astrology. Number 1, Complex PTSD. This book hit real hard, and I don't think I have anything else to say about that. And now, onto fiction books. Again, the ranking for fiction is much looser. So, 19, The Witch's Daughter. I basically just forced myself to finish this one, but it was okay. 18, A Raisin in the Sun. The reason I read this play is because of something relating to my job. So I wasn't as into it, but I had that like external motivation to finish it. But it was interesting literature. I just didn't super enjoy it. I don't know. 17, Hedda Gabler. Similar story. Also, I don't think people should read Hedda Gabler without looking at trigger warnings. So that's what I'm gonna say on that. 16, Rapunzel, the one with all the hair. Fun little book. The book that got me back into fiction. So, 15, House Witch. This was the second fiction book I read this year. It was also fun, but like it could have done so much more interesting stuff with the premise than what it did, so I was a little disappointed at the end. 14, American Born Chinese. This one's also relating to my job, the reason that I read it. So it was a really interesting graphic novel. I think it would be really interesting to like properly analyze it, but I just sort of read through it fast, and it was enjoyable, but I didn't like love it. I don't know. It was a good book. Next we have The Nature of Witches. So this one I read in June. I think it's a fun little witch book. Got some bisexual representation. Again, I was like slightly underwhelmed with where they went with the plot. That's just me. Then we have 12, The Marvelous. This was an interesting book. The suspense was really there, which is interesting because like it doesn't look like a super suspenseful book, but it was cool, interesting. There was, I think, queer representation, vaguely. I don't think anything super explicit happened with any of the romance plots. Subplots, whatever. But yeah. 11, Cinder, a book surely I should have read ages ago. I actually really enjoyed this, and I went to start the second book, and I realized it was from a totally different character's perspective, and I was like, I don't want to have to care about a new character. I want to know what happened to Cinder. And so it lost me. But this first book was super cool. And I am into like fairy tale classic rewriting, re-exploration, as you can see from other stuff on my list. So number 10, When We Were Magic. This was another interesting little queer witch book. It's different. It's very different with where they go with the plot. Less fun what happens, but super interesting, I would say. Number 9, Red, White, and Royal Blue. This was one of those like you gotta reads that I actually read, and I somewhat mostly enjoyed it. I mean, it was a fun rom-com. I feel like they spent so long at the end wrapping everything up after like the main plot had ended. That's the main reason I ranked it a little lower, is because that ending sort of dragged on to me. 8, Upright Women Wanted. This one was one of the first main hints or part of me being like, I have a sweet spot for queer sci-fi fantasy women focused books, and this one was a short little fun thing, and I also liked how it was sort of cowboy. 7, These Witches Don't Burn. This one I really liked. I liked the excitement of the plot a lot more, and I was really like swept up in it more so than some of the other books, but it was very YA, sort of whiny teen at times, which is why I haven't read the sequel yet, even though I really liked it. I don't know. This ranking is very subjective. This could be like plus or minus 2 or 3. Next, 6, Gideon the Ninth, the last book I read this year. It hits that sweet spot, queer, women-focused, sci-fi fantasy. I have started the second one, but not finished it yet. 5, We Hunt the Flame. I really enjoyed this as one of the first things I got back into within fantasy, because sometimes fantasy is really hard to get into, but I did enjoy the premise of this one. Again, I could see moving this like down a couple, but also I could see it staying here. 4, Lost in the Neverwoods. This one made me sob. But it was so good, but it made me sob. 3, One Last Stop. Loved this one. It definitely leaned more like rom-com, but it had that little bit of like sci-fi going on in it that made it super fun. But it was really good for a rom-com, gotta say. And then Cemetery Boys. This one hits so hard. Oh my god, my heart was so tied up in it. I probably also cried. I don't remember though, because it was a little longer ago. But I was like begging my friends to read it after I finished it, even though none of of them have. Whatever, though. And my number one, The Jasmine Throne. This was the ultimate queer fantasy women-focused book for me this year. It was so good, and I'm like so desperate for the second one to come out. I even bought this book for my friend for Christmas because she said she would read it if I bought it for her, so I bought it for her. And that's how much I care about it. So, look at that. Look at that excitement about books that we have back. I thank you for coming along this journey with me. I'm so happy to have read all these books in 2021, and for 2022, I'm gonna try to keep reminding myself, no judgment, no pressure. Pick up the book, read it if you like it. If you're not excited about it anymore, you don't need to finish it. We're gonna see how that goes, starting with finishing the sequel to Gideon the Ninth, which is Harrow the Ninth. I'm off to read TTYL. Bye.